Welcome to the lab. This is the Bake Scientist channel where we explore the why so you know how. Today we are exploring the why behind a classic bread staple, English muffins. If you want to know how 7 simple ingredients, including water, can create these light, chewy muffins full of nooks and crannies, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to stay up to date on all this delicious science. Now let's get into it. So first we're going to start by activating our yeast. Here I have my warm water and milk mixed together, and I'm just going to add some sugar to it to give the yeast something to eat while they're waking up. And when we activate yeast, what we're doing is we are waking them up out of their dormant state to get them active and ready to start creating all that carbon dioxide as they eat the different sugars and things in the dough and in all the things that we're adding to this bread. And it also helps to make sure that the yeast is actually alive. Sometimes, if the yeast that you're using is too old, it just won't work. The microorganisms are just old and they won't they won't come back alive when they're added to the water and the milk. So I just added the yeast in here, and we're just going to mix it up, dissolve the yeast in there, and set them aside for probably about 10 minutes and let them start activating. And once they're ready and they've been activated, you'll see that there's a foam is created on top, and it starts smelling really yeasty. You'll be able to see once it's ready. So now I'm going to go ahead and mix together our remaining ingredients, which is our flour and some salt. You never want to add your salt directly to your yeast because salt actually can kill yeast. So I'm going to mix it into the flour so that it's all incorporated, but never mix it with your yeast directly. Or if you have dry yeast, you're putting it into your flour mixture, never dump your yeast on top of the salt. Now I'm going to add my bowl to the stand mixer, and our yeast has been sitting for about 10 minutes, so it's ready. And I'll show you, once I get the dough hook on, what that looks like. So the yeast, as you can see, has foamed up. See this nice thick foam on the top? That's the yeast creating that carbon dioxide from the sugars it's eating. And you can see on the side of the glass, through the side of the glass, you can see all the little bubbles that it's created. That big layer of thick foam. That's when you know your yeast is ready and it's ready to start working in your dough. So let's go ahead and just pour it in, and that's really all you need for English muffins. We're going to pour this into our dry ingredients, mix it up, and we'll have our dough. And while that's mixing, let's go ahead and talk about the science of an English muffin. So one important thing to understand about flour and dough in general, especially when making breads, is that when you add water to flour, the flour proteins glutathin and gliadin actually combine and they form gluten. And this reaction can be amplified by kneading. So you can create more and more gluten by kneading the dough because you're increasing the contact the flour proteins are getting with the water that you've added. This is going to develop the gluten bonds. And for gluten, you got to think gluten actually acts similarly to kind of how bubblegum is. Now I say this because if you think about bubblegum, it's sticky, it stretches, and when you blow bubbles, the air is captured inside of the gum. And the same thing's kind of happening in your bread. So the gluten is your bubblegum, and the yeast is creating your gas, which is the air that would be in the bubblegum. So as the yeast feed off of the sugars that we've added, and also the sugars found in the flour itself, and the milk and everything else we've added to the dough, they create carbon dioxide as a byproduct. So as they're creating the carbon dioxide, the gases are coming out, and the gluten is expanding to hold those gases. And when they expand, this is creating small gaps and holes in your dough. And when the dough is cooked, the gluten becomes a solid structure, like it gelatinizes and becomes a solid. And those air pockets are still there. And that's where the texture for your bread and any baked good really is coming from. So that texture is determined by how much gluten, because if you have less gluten in your dough, you're not going to have as many pockets. And if you have more gluten, you'll have more pockets and they'll be stronger. And then also depending on the yeast, how well the yeast is working, you'll have more carbon dioxide or less carbon dioxide. Another thing unique to English muffins is that the water, so English muffins are actually cooked on top of the stove. They're not cooked in the oven like a normal bread. And because of this, a lot of water is released from the dough. And as the water is released in the form of steam. And this steam also helps to create tunnels and holes in the interior of the dough, which is where you get those unique nooks and crannies from, along with the carbon dioxide the yeast is creating. So this is achieved by cooking the dough over low and sustained heat. And this is why we cook in a skillet. So it looks like my dough is ready. It's no longer sticking to my fingers. So let's go ahead and pull it off the dough hook and get going with the rest of this recipe. So once we have our dough, we're going to go ahead and put it onto a surface to work with for a little bit. And I like to use oil. You don't want to add any more flour to your dough. You just want it to not stick, but you still need to be able to work with it. So I just sprayed my hands and the surface down with a little bit of oil. And I'm also going to spray the bowl with some oil because this is the bowl I'm going to rise my dough in. Right now, I'm not going to really knead it. I'm more going to just shape it into a nice ball so that it can just rest a little bit in the bowl. And we're going to let this rest for about an hour, or at least until it doubles in size. So that just depends on the temperature in your kitchen and how any other factors, how active your yeast is, all those kind of things, how quickly it's going to rise. And what I like to do is I like to stick the bowl either in the microwave or the oven, not turned on, not heated at all, but I find that kind of controls the temperature in the room, and those usually are a little bit warmer of a space than just the countertop, especially in the winter. So I'm just going to cover some plastic wrap and also with a kitchen towel and just set it aside for about an hour or until it doubles in size. Okay, so it's been about an hour. Our dough's doubled in size, as you can see here. And I'm just going to turn it out on the surface again. And again, I'm not going to use any extra flour. I'm just going to go ahead and spray the workspace down with some oil along with my hands. And we're going to turn this out. And what I like to do is I like to weigh my dough to make sure I cut this into uniform pieces. So I like all of my English muffins to be about the same size. So that's just me, but you can eyeball it. You don't have to have a scale. You can just cut it up into however many pieces you want, and that's it. And I will say this dough is very soft, very, very soft, and it's very pliable, and it's not sticky at all, and it's nice to work with. But again, I'm going to measure mine, or weigh mine, and then cut it up into pieces, and then we're going to roll each piece into little balls, and then I'll show you what the next steps are. I'm going to take a moment to ask you guys if you are liking this content and you like understanding the science behind all your favorite foods and your favorite baked goods, and understanding what's really going on in that baked good and that food, so that you can really understand how to make it your own and how to fix things when they go wrong, or what you're looking at, what's happening. It's so informative, and it really helps you to become a better baker, a better cook, just a better at any of the little things you like to do in the kitchen. If you're liking this content, if you like the science, please make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can stay up to date on everything that's happening in the kitchen. Okay, now once we have all of our dough into the sizes that we want, you go ahead and just take each piece and we're going to roll it into a little ball. And I like to just roll it between my hands and kind of mold it into a nice tight little ball. And I'll just roll it around between my hands and onto the surface and just make sure that it's nice and round and there's well, there's seam, but it's not irregular shaped. So after we get all of our dough shaped into the balls, we're going to go ahead and take some cornmeal and pour it on the bottom of this sheet pan. And the reason why we're using cornmeal is because cornmeal actually helps to elevate the dough a little bit when we're cooking it in the pan, so that it doesn't stick to the pan and it doesn't burn. And this is important because, like I said, these are a very unique kind of dough, or kind of bread, where it's actually cooked on top of the stove and not baked in the oven like most breads. So go ahead and put your dough balls onto the cornmeal and just line them up on the tray. And what we're going to do, we're actually going to let them rise a little bit more for about 30 more minutes. So we're just preparing them, because once they rise, we're going to put them straight into the pan to cook. So I'm just going to get them all on this pan and coat it in some cornmeal on the top and bottoms. Now I actually want to flatten them a little bit, because the characteristic shape of English muffins are they're a little more disc-like. So instead of just being a big ball, I like to flatten them on the top so that they get that disc shape. And after we flattened all of our dough balls, we're gonna add a little bit more cornmeal to the top of each dough ball, just to, like I said, to coat them, because when they do cook in the pan, we want to make sure that they don't stick and that they have a little bit of that elevation off the pan so that they cook evenly and they don't burn. So these are looking pretty good, so we're going to go ahead and cover these in some plastic wrap and a kitchen towel, and let them sit for about 30 minutes. We don't want them to get too big, we don't want too much proofing, because English muffins aren't super light and fluffy on the inside. They're a little bit more of a denser bread, so we don't want them to get too overproofed, but we do want them to rise just a little bit more. So we're gonna let them sit for about 30 minutes, 20-30 minutes, and you'll see the size that they get to when we come back. So my dough has risen for about 30 minutes, and as you can see, they've gotten a little bit bigger, not necessarily doubled in size, but just a little bit bigger. And so now they're actually ready to go ahead and get into the pan and start cooking. So let's take them on over to the stove. So you want to make sure your pan is on a low heat. The goal is to cook these low, because if you cook them too fast, what you run the risk of doing is burning the outside while the inside is still doughy. So the key is to cook it over very low heat. And I had my stove on the setting 1, so it's pretty low. And you can use butter or you can use a dry pan. Either way for me. I like to use butter in the beginning, and I don't really add butter as I cook the rest of them. But I just like to grease it down one good time, and then from there they don't really seem to stick. And the cornmeal does help with that as well. So what we're going to do here, the whole idea behind cooking these English muffins in a skillet, is that the warm skillet will actually heat the dough, which helps soften the dough. And since we're using a very low heat, what's happening is the starches in the flour start to gelatinize, and the yeast, they feed off of starches, and they're also, when it's warm, they actually get more active. So because it's not super hot, the yeast are not killed right away. So because it's a warm environment with that gelatin that they love, start becoming even more active, and they start creating more of their carbon dioxide bubbles as the they start cooking. And then the yeast start to die off because at some point it's going to get a little too hot for them. So as they start dying off, the gas bubbles get trapped in that gluten, and they've created a lot more gas bubbles as they've been sitting in this warm environment with the gelatinized starches. And in addition to that carbon dioxide that the yeast have been creating, there's also steam coming from the water that's being released from the flour and the dough. And so that releasing of the water, as we're cooking very slowly, creates the steam, which creates those tunnels, that creates the nooks and crannies. And then we also have the addition of the carbon dioxide from the yeast. So we're getting a lot of the nice little nook and cranny, bubbly look on the inside of our English muffins. And as you can see, I flip these a few times, and I like to just make sure that they get all the butter off the pan so that it doesn't burn too much. And again, this is just low heat, and I flip them once. And what I actually like to do to make sure the interior is cooked all the way through is you add a lid. And for the last few minutes of cooking, you just let them sit with the lid on, and they'll be perfect on the inside. So these look about ready, and you'll feel how much lighter they are once they're finished cooking. They're very light. And here it is, our final result. Some delicious, chewy, yet crispy on the outside English muffins that are completely full of nooks and crannies. And I like to actually use a fork to open these. So if you use a knife, you kind of run the risk of smushing the nooks and crannies on the inside. But if you use a fork and just poke around the edges, it opens up beautifully, and you see all those nooks and crannies. And you can go ahead and toast these or eat them as is. Either way, they're amazing. Just make sure that you've let them cool completely before you start enjoying them. Now, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below letting us know how you like to eat your English muffins. And until next time, happy baking!